I hope we go live. Hello, hello, everybody. All right, and we should be live. Wonderful. Hello, everybody. I'd say we give it another 2 minutes or 1 minute for people to join, and then we'll do the official opening and welcome. All right, and I think in the interest of time, we can get going. Welcome to our 7th and unfortunately, sadly, last event of our public conversation series, South Designs Planetary Futures. My name is Lauren Kula-Wenz, and I just want to share a few words on the series before I'm going to hand over to my colleague Kenny Coopers, who has been co-hosting the series with me, to then introduce our wonderful speakers for today. So South Designs as a project is part of the Swiss government-funded project Governing Through Design, which supports critical and creative research on how design intervenes in everyday life worlds and in planetary politics. Within this initiative, 2 years ago, actually, we launched a call for projects to ask for proposals that explore how design, thought and practiced in different ways, in various ways from the South, forges planetary futures. And we were very lucky and blessed to receive over 150 proposals from across the world. So many people responded to our calls. And with the help of a scientific committee, we were able to refine our conceptual approach and then also select these 6 projects that we've now funded, of which the Speculative Visions of the Great Green Wall is one. And the 6 teams who were awarded funding, they have been working for 2 years now. And there will also be some links in the chat that give you an overview of the projects and some of the teams behind it and just some of the thinking on this project, on this overall kind of envelope. Without further ado, I'd hand over to Kenny to introduce the project and the speakers for today, which I'm very excited about because it also features our lovely colleague Orit Halpern, who is actually part of the Synergia project. But Kenny will say more about this now.
Yeah, so welcome everyone, and just a few words on the project. So the Great Green Wall project is an existing massive project, even though it's also elusive and hard to grasp, and that's what we will be talking about in part today. And then grounding speculative visions of the Great Green Wall project is a kind of redesign or an attempt to tackle the ways in which we can think about how this impacts communities, such large greening projects, and conversely or reversely, how communities can actually be part or made to be part of this project. So the project co-designs a speculative interface that visualizes the impact of community-led restoration and development choices. This project is done by a team of which we have only one representative here, but she will tell us who else is behind that team very soon. Meredith Roots Bernstein is a conservationist, a conservation ecologist, and ethnobiologist who researches approaches to restoration in socio-ecological systems, and predominantly in marginal locations, semi-arid and anthropogenic habitats. And she has been developing a rewilding project in central Chile and has also co-founded an NGO there to support these efforts. And in conversation will be our own, if I may say that, Orit Halpern, who's a full professor and chair of digital cultures at the TU in Dresden in Germany. And her work bridges histories of science, computing, and cybernetics with design. And particularly relevant for today is her work on planetary impacts of machine learning and experimentation in science. As well as in engineering and design. So I think this will be a perfect match with the kind of biological, environmental approaches and community-based approaches that Meredith will tell us more about today. So if I may give the word already to Meredith to just say a few words about the constitution of the team and how you work together, I think that will be a good preface to get us going on the conversation.
Yeah, thank you. So we're a team, we're quite a mixed team. I'll just go through, I don't want to forget anyone, so I'll just go through everyone in order. Well, maybe I should first explain how we met each other. Maybe that makes more sense. So I was working with an anthropologist colleague named Cyril Lamoureux. And she's an STS scholar who has worked in Sudan for a long time. And she wanted to do a collaboration with me, which was going to be about use of data in the Great Green Wall. That project never happened for the pandemic. Or it happened in a different way, not in the way we planned. But because of her, I made contact with some researchers, ecologists in Sudan, one of whom I met in person and one of whom I've still not met in person. The one I have not met in person is Hafiz. We'll see a video from him about what we're doing. Hafiz Mohammed Adam. So he works for he worked for FAO, the Forestry International Forestry Organization, and is an expert in forestry and conservation. And the other member of the team from Sudan is Hussein Suleiman, and he's a researcher and an ecologist working with remote sensing and ecology and conservation issues in Sudan. And then there's another anthropologist who Siri and I both knew, who is Alexa Haggerty. She's also a member of the team. She's very interested in technology and also through a science and technology studies lens. And then there's me, who, as was said, I'm an ecologist, conservationist, researcher. And finally, my others, which I don't remember if it was mentioned in the introduction of me, I also teach at the design school, Eindhoven Design Academy. I teach different courses each year, basically, but they're mainly around ecology or around human, non-human interactions, obviously in a design context. So one of my former students from that course, and it's, sorry, I should have said the geodesign master's course at Eindhoven Design Academy. He was Connor Cook, and I was interested in his work and his approach. So it's like a kind of very heterogeneous group of people who came together because of personal contacts. But yes, and unfortunately, only I could be here today. But I will not necessarily speak for them, but try to at least show my hopes for the project at this stage.
Thank you so much. And now I just want to tell you a little bit about the structure of the conversation today. It's a little bit more structured maybe than some of the other ones that we've had before. Since we have an existing project that we should learn about first, the Great Green Wall. So we'll spend the first part of our conversation better understanding that project and critiquing it. In part two, then Meredith will focus and present briefly on the research that the group has done. And then again, a conversation will follow with Orit on questions of research methods, how that work was done, and the challenges, of course, obvious and less obvious perhaps, that come with this kind of research. And then in the third part of this conversation, we'll talk about the alternative or the speculative proposal the design proposal that is underway from the group. And then after that, we'll have a Q&A. But I think since we're also a small group, we can see if there's field any questions from the audience beforehand as well in those three parts. So Meredith, if you want to start us off by telling a little bit about this elusive project, and I think you also have some video for us to show.
Yeah, I have a little PowerPoint and video. Let me share the screen. That's here. Yeah. Okay, so yes, the title is Grounding Speculative Visions of the Great Green Wall in Sudan. So there are many visions, and we're trying to somehow relate them to what you could call, I don't know, I don't want to say reality, but something on the ground, let's put it that way. There's almost too much background for the Great Green Wall to really summarize quickly. So I'll just summarize very, very quickly. And then if there are questions, I think that we can take questions maybe about what is the reality of the project. But it is an existing project which has been around for a couple of decades, which is, as this sort of schema suggests, the idea is to reforest or forest for the first time, perhaps, areas that stretch from Senegal to Djibouti, basically. And as you can sort of imagine, if you know something about the geography of the Sahel region, this is really, this line is, I think, you know, it's sort of supposed to be defined in a scientific way according to some climate variables or something, but basically it's somewhere in between the bottom of the Sahara and, you know, the edge between the very dry Sahara and where it gets wetter, basically. So it's supposed to be some kind of barrier against degradation and or desertification, which technically are two different processes that are not always clearly distinguished in this project. But if we think of desertification as the movement south of the Sahara, that's pretty much understood to be caused by climate variables on the long term, and it has moved up and down, north and south, over very long time periods, and there's very little we can do about that, actually. But degradation is also not very well defined. Let's say, well, desertification is well defined. Degradation is not very well defined, and it has something to do with a decline in the performance or value or resources or productivity of a habitat. And so it's widely claimed that the Sahel is degraded, and so replanting trees or planting trees for the first time is supposed to reverse that degradation and be very good both for nature, for carbon storage, for water cycling and provision, for you know, human welfare, for making a living from the land, etc. It's supposed to have lots and lots of benefits. And it has a huge number of actors involved in this project. So it's, you know, a multi-state project, but it's run independently, basically, at each state level. Senegal is one of the most advanced in terms of actually planting trees. Sudan, we're working in Sudan partly because Sudan also has historically, in moments when there hasn't been some kind of political crisis going on, been very good also at implementing the project. Some of the other countries, not so much. It's actually very difficult to know what's going on in all of the countries. But also there's a highly complex, not necessarily very well functioning or like very, let's say, very opaque management structure of this whole project at an international level. But it gets quite a bit of money through the UN, different UN organizations. And a lot of that money and sort of the reasons for that, like the justification of that funding, has shifted over time from really just being straight up tree planting to now being this sort of semi non-explicit argument about how planting trees will prevent illegal migration out of the Sahel and into Europe. That sounds a little bit far-fetched, which is why no one makes that argument really explicitly, but they often refer to the idea that this project as a whole will somehow, control illegal migration. So just to give you a sense of what the project claims it's doing, we can look at this promotional video that was made by the Great Green Wall project, the one of the sort of international levels of management, sort of made and promoted this video, which is called The Great Green Wall Virtual Reality Film. So I want to point out the title because it's a little bit weird, and we'll discuss maybe why does it have that title. So I'm just going to go to YouTube, and it's, I think, 6 minutes long, and then we'll discuss a little bit what's going on in this video.
Oh,
You hear it, right?
a great green wall that will stretch across Africa. One day it will be a wonder of the world. We have lived on this land all our lives. It is our home. Before I was born, the land started changing and our crops stopped growing. Lots of people had to move away. Some went to the city. Others moved further away, even to other countries. But we are changing all of this. My name is Binta. I live in a small village in Senegal. My grandfather can remember when our land was beautiful and clean, and the rains would always fall. We have had a dream for many years to bring life back to our land and make our lives better. And now it's coming true. We are growing a line of trees and plants that will stretch all the way to the next village. And the next village is doing the same. But we are doing more than just growing trees. My grandfather says that we are growing food so we'll have more to eat, so we can all stay together in our village, even if our climate is changing. Already our well is filling up. And now my mother doesn't have to walk for hours to get water. There's more work for everyone. And the market is busy again. I feel very proud of our new forest. It is 8 years old, the same as me. We are one small village. We are not alone. There are thousands of villages just like us, all making their lands healthy and strong. Growing food, working the land, and giving us hope for the future. My grandfather says that all of this here is part of a great green wall that will stretch across Africa. He says it is going to be a wonder of the world. A symbol that together we can make a difference. This is a fragile land, but it is our land, our home. And together we are strong.
Okay. Let me go back to my list. Yeah, so I mean, for me, a couple interesting points about that film. First of all, obviously it is not a virtual reality film, right? Because virtual reality is something else. Virtual reality is like a simulation where you're like wearing a headset and you can interact with stuff. That's definitely not what this is, right? So I find it a little bit interesting that they deliberately called it a virtual reality film. I don't know what they think they mean by that. Maybe I'll say what I think it means in a second, but not only is it not what it says in the title, but it also you know, presents itself as a documentary style video, and it's not, it's propaganda. There's several things in there they said which cannot be like an actual thing that happened. I don't think, you know, it's just like the way the well filled with water after they started planting crops. I don't know, it just doesn't really happen like that. It doesn't, and even if it did happen like that, it's just anecdotal and doesn't, I don't know. So I think it's you know, it's pure propaganda, and it's passed off to look like something that really happened. I mean, that's not so unusual, but there's a lot of I think deliberate confusion in this film, and it's throughout the entire project really, between an image, the image that the Great Green Wall Project wants to project, which is very much just an image of how they want the Sahel to be, you know, developed and with people who don't migrate illegally to Europe, and you know, I don't know, you know, a certain specific notion of how the state will control people so they're not nomadic either, and they stay in their village, and they're all farmers. Notice there was no herders, although there are loads of herders in the Sahel. So it's a very specific political vision of how they would like the Sahel to be, and it has almost nothing to do with the reality of what the project is doing, like the claim that each village is planting a load of trees which are all going to like literally connect in a belt is also completely false. That's not even how the project is implemented. It's like maybe 10 very small square plantations in each country. Like they don't touch each other by any means. It's like that's not what's happening. Yeah, so I think in some sense when they say it's a virtual reality film, they're giving, I don't know why they use that name, but it seems to me that they're giving something away about how the whole entire project is like an exercise in image creation and image circulation, and which has almost nothing to do with what's happening on the ground, and any trees that are actually being planted have nothing to do, like we don't know what effects they're having, if any, and they certainly are not having any of the high level political effects that the project is supposed to be delivering. So there's a huge disconnect between the actual project on the ground and, you know, all the imagery of this type, which is like highly stereotyped, highly, yeah, imaginary. So it is a kind of virtual reality, just not what we mean usually when we say virtual reality. And so, yeah, there's something which is of course frustrating about this for someone like me who does work with conservation and restoration in rural areas. I have not worked in the Sahel before, but with the contacts that we had in Sudan, it seemed like there was an opportunity to try to see what was actually happening on the ground in a specific location in Sudan, and what it was that people actually wanted. Like if there are all these, you know, high level funders who come to some kind of, you know, forum or exposition in Dubai or whatever, and they see this kind of video, and they're like, oh yeah, that's a great project, I want to give a couple million or $1 billion or whatever, at a very high level, right? And then who knows what really happens to the money, but it gets planted according to some forester's idea of forestry plantations, which is a square, and I don't know, you know, it's completely top down, it's completely disconnected from reality on the ground, and no one necessarily even cares about the reality on the ground because it's all in the service of feeding this virtual reality image of the political outcome that's desired. So I thought like, if all this money is coming in and there's a lot of opacity about how it's actually used, you know, maybe there's a chance that if we provided a completely different image, that we could somehow get people's money to be pledged towards something that's actually based on bottom-up local perceptions, local desires of what reforestation could do for them in a highly contextualized manner. based on their knowledge and their interests. And in a way also, which aesthetically would make a really clear distinction between reality and proposal, I guess. Yeah, so that's what I had prepared for the first bit.
Great, thank you so much. Orit, do you want to jump in here and give us your thoughts on the project?
Well, obviously, I mean, I recall helping choose this project, so I think this general question of the forms of image making that we have and the way they kind of get co-produced with also technologies as well as sensor infrastructures is really critical. But like if we have a different image of what forestry or reclamation or I'm not really sure. It would be great to hear a little more about how people understand from both scientifically as well as from the local communities what precisely or how they understand the green wall actually working, since we know very often that just planting trees doesn't really work. But I'm really compelled by this vision or this question of the way that greenness is kind of gets associated with just putting trees in, which you see that in architecture a lot, like trees on buildings and stuff, and they're totally unsustainable and probably even bad. So there's this fundamental question, of course, of if this is even doing environmental management, either from the eco kind of in terms of its own goals of kind of reducing degradation. Like I'm kind of interested in hearing from you both. What would the scientists want to say, and then your vision of how you think you can integrate the kind of aspirations of the communities. I don't even know if they speak in terms of environment or environmental management or the desertification. I don't know actually like and obviously it's a huge area. So I guess maybe you can talk a little bit about exactly where you guys are working and where you're situated. But on the whole, I find this fundamental question about how we envision greenness and how we deal with the scales of it is really, really key, not just in this specific case, but more globally about how we understand environmental management and like planetary futures, because the questions you're posing come up around lots of other geoengineering and terraforming projects that are supposed to manage or mitigate the impacts of the climate crisis, very often, of course, around how those images of greenness manage, right, precarity, political economic questions, and generally also displacement and migration. So you bring up a lot of questions that I think feed into the broader issue of how we image and imagine managing the climate crisis through large-scale infrastructures. And also, I'd like to hear just a lot more from you about the specific locations where you're actually working and what the discourses might be on the ground then around the environmental situation.
Well, I'll show you some images from on the ground when I discuss what we're actually doing on the ground. But so the project that we're implementing is being done in Gadarif state, which is I can't see my mouse, but I think it's like roughly like where it says Sudan and there's a little deer underneath that. It's sort of in that area. And luckily for the project and everyone involved in it, that area has been fairly conflict-free all this time. So the projects have been able to continue despite the civil war, which is now going on in Sudan. So, luckily for them, luckily for us, in terms of the project, it's a problem, and we can discuss maybe also in what ways that's been a problem. But luckily, yeah, that area is not in the midst of a war at the moment. So, yeah, in terms of greenness, I mean, yeah, another interesting, I guess, aspect of the visuals that they use in this Great Green Wall film is the way it zooms out at the end, right? And you see the whole planet with this like fake green line on it, which obviously you wouldn't be able to see from space, because in reality it's like it would be a couple kilometers wide and yeah, not continuous. So it's also completely fake. But there's a lot of I think the vision for the project has been sort of driven by and to a large extent imagined at the scale of the planetary. So even though in most of the video they make it sound like it's a village scale project, it really isn't, because first of all, it's imagined as this kind of cross-continental international project. So it's not even at the scale of individual countries. It's seen as this kind of what's like a product of the African Union. So there's also this political level of seeing it as kind of a trans-African or trans-Saharan scale. And I guess not inconsequentially, this line that they trace with the tree planting also traces, important transcontinental highway routes and, traditional migration routes of, nomadic routes and so on. So it's also a connector in several senses. And also most of the sort of active, let's say, academic research, either about what should be done in the project or kind of like simulations of what could happen in the project, occur mainly through remote, the analysis of remote sensing data. So very little data percolates up from the ground. I mean, not that there's no data at all from the ground, but it's sort of reported at a national scale and held in some national, some I don't know, Excel sheet on a website in some, of whatever agency is in charge of that bit of that project. So there's nothing. It's hard to get all the data together. It's hard to find the data. It's hard to compare the data. The data is usually just sort of administrative sort of thing. Like we planted 100 trees of this type. It's not even ecological data, particularly like what's the ecological impact of it. Or social impact. Most of the social data is like we did X number of workshops. That's nice, but like, what are the sort of other impacts, as opposed to just sort of like, I held a workshop, but what was the larger, longer term impact of the project? Nobody knows. So because there's very little data, and the data that is there is not so interesting coming from the ground, all of the sort of monitoring, but also speculation about the future of the project is done from satellite data. So, and it's analyzed by people who sometimes know something about the project on the ground, but a lot of time are people like from NASA who've never been there, know nothing about it, and are really just interested in a technical problem like, can they detect individual trees from space, right? And they use the Great Green Wall as a kind of a case study in which to do their technical wizardry, because that makes it sound more relevant, right? Like, yes, we detected a bunch of individual trees in Mali or something, this will be really useful for the Great Green Wall. Well, I mean, it's not going to be really useful for the Great Green Wall because people in Mali already know where their individual trees are. But, it's so there's also a sociology of science thing going on where that's how they valorize technical advances. But for this set of reasons, all of the sort of visualizations of the Great Green Wall as it is or as it may be in the future come from this view from space, this very decontextualized, very large scale view. So I think when you think about greening at that scale, it's almost in a very literal sense, like, yeah, the pixels are green, like there's just sort of literally a kind of a projection of greenness, and it's very, so it has a lot of symbolic potential, but I don't think it doesn't really go deeper than that sort of general symbolism. It just sort of works off of that. And you can also see, if you look at the social media from the official Great Green Wall, like Instagram and so on, which are not super active, but they do exist. Even though the project, as I said, has sort of moved on to be a very political project, sort of an anti-migration project, and it's not clear what tree planting really has to do with that, or how that will actually intervene in the problems in a meaningful way. But they on all their social media imagery, they constantly talk about tree planting, and all the symbolism around the green tree and the planting of little tree and the holding the tree and all this stuff. And that's also when you see individuals from like on the ground sites where they're implementing the Great Green Wall, when they post, and tag this account or whatever, they are also almost always posting about tree planting. I mean, the symbolism of tree planting is amazing, right? It's all about regeneration, and it's all about care, and it's about growth and renewal. And so it's this amazing symbolism which everybody on the ground level, but at every level, loves this sort of symbolism. So I think to a large degree, even though the project maybe is only a tiny bit about tree planting at this point, they have no reason to give up on that sort of symbolism of greening and tree planting, because that's what makes the project look really attractive, basically.
Okay. Are we having conversation, or did you want to present more of your, I don't know.
I don't know,
there's
should I go
more.
on, Kenny, or what do you want to do now?
Yeah, I think let's go hear a bit more about the research that you did. I think we have a good sense now of the enormous shortcomings of this project. So it'd be good to hear a bit more about your approach.
Sure. Okay. So what we wanted to do, I mean, originally when we proposed the project, the plan was that we could all go to Sudan and participate in the field work, in which would involve basically interviewing people in Gedaref, using different techniques, sort of ethnobiology techniques, to understand their preferences, their insights about tree planting, about forests, about what use are trees to them, and how would they like them to be organized in the landscape, basically. But yeah, because of the political instability and the civil war, which then started, that became impossible. So no one else can go there, which introduced some kind of interesting challenges, which I'll discuss maybe at the end. But so Hafiz and Hussein were there for a long time, and then they've both left and they've gone to Egypt, but they still have a team which they were already working with, like colleagues who were helping them with the on the ground interview and workshops and so on. So they are now communicating with their team from Egypt. So basically we communicate with them from like France and Europe, and then they communicate to their team in Sudan, and then their team in Sudan sends them back stuff, and then they translate that for us, because only Siri speaks Arabic, so they have to translate it. And then we're like, okay, that's really interesting, but I don't understand X and Y, and so then we have to get back in touch with them. So there's like a chain going back and forth. But anyway, in terms of the kind of techniques that we have been using to understand what the local people in this particular village in Yadarif, where I think that Hafiz and Hussein had been working before, they already had contacts there, are so image elicitation. So there's kind of two ways of doing that, which we've done one, and then we're going to try doing the other one next time. So there's several phases, right, of the on the ground research. So in the first phase, we sent a set of images, which I'll show you in a second, from the area, and asked people to sort of explain what they see, how they interpret that formation of trees or that habitat. And that's really helpful for us also, because yeah, you don't I'll mention this when you see the objects, but like you need an interpretation to understand an image. And then what we're going to ask them to do in the next two phases of fieldwork is to draw, or maybe photograph, but I think we prefer drawings, to draw the trees, their interactions with trees, their interactions with habitats, and the kind of habitat structures that they would consider to be a natural forest or a community forest, like a nice community forest. Like, what would they like a community forest to be structured as? What's a nice forest and a nice natural forest? How should that look? So we've really insisted that drawings might be the best technique, because again, if they take a picture I don't think we'll understand what's in the picture. We won't know what we're seeing. But if they draw, no matter like how bad the childish the drawing is or whatever, like if maybe they just label it or give some description, it's easier to interpret, I think. It doesn't have to be very accurate visually. It just more in terms of understanding what they think are the elements and the relationship between those elements in the landscape. So we've also asked them to name all the tree species they know and like the trends in terms of are those tree species, you know, increasing in abundance, decreasing in abundance, and how do they use them, or you know, if they have uses or not. And then yeah, Hussein in particular had some previous training in community mapping. So in this case, in this cultural context, you know, the way it works is you kind of have to do men and women separately. So we have a men's group that made a map of how their village is now and then how they would like it to be if you could plant trees in the way that they would prefer. And the women did the same thing. So I'll show you those. Yeah, and we've had one round of fieldwork so far, and we had a bunch of questions. So they're now preparing the second 2 rounds. And I will just play you this video from Hafiz. So the internet connection with them is not always really good, so that's why we decided to just ask him to send a video. And are just having a problem because I can't, there's something covering the arrow. So wait, sorry, I have to do it this way.
Hi everyone.
Oops, it stops when I do that. Okay, we'll just watch it this way.
Hi everyone. This is a short video just to talk briefly about what we will do in the coming couple of weeks or so in the next month. Actually, we try to translate the questionnaire for the round 2 data collection to very simple Arabic and be more digestible for our participant in the field. And also we will talk in details with our field team there, talking about how we can manage data collection and drawing and all activities related. And definitely this way of data collection or research approach will be participatory approach and bottom-up approach. I believe that this approach will have the benefits to community or participants when they are feel free to express their thoughts and their belief and their ideas about managing of natural resource and selection of tree species and type of plantation they want. Unlike what has been done for several years by the governments represented by Forest National Corporation, as it was adopted the top-down approach, and people will be far from the all stages of intervention, from ideas, planning, monitoring, or so we feel that people here can change their thoughts among each other and change of their experience and indigenous knowledge about the various type of trees they wanted, how to plant it, what is the benefits they can get, and also will be sure sustainability of this intervention if it happens, because from the beginning, people will feel the ownership of this type of intervention. And in addition to that, people will, this approach of studying and involving of people from Brazil will definitely fostering a sense of belonging, further building strong social connections. In addition, I feel that building strong social connections among them and enhancing personal well-being. Thank you.
So that yeah, it's from Hafiz, and that's about what they'll be doing next. Oops, sorry. I want to go to the next. Yes. Okay. So these are some of the images that were used, not all of them, but a few of them that were used in the first round of image elicitation. So I mean, this partly gives you a sense of what it looks like in Gedaref state, for one thing. So it is, of course, quite arid, and it has these kind of open woodlands or scrublands. And I think also what I want to emphasize here is that even though, let's say, I'm an ecologist who's worked in different kinds of arid, semi-arid habitat, woodlands, I have some ideas when I look at these pictures, like what am I looking at? I can say, this is an open woodland and this is a grassland. And one of them is a plantation and the other one probably looks like it is not. And these look like they're probably, are they shrubs or are they baby trees? Like, I don't know. When you look at a photograph of a habitat that you don't know, there are a million things that someone who does know that area could interpret from it. But if you're not from that place, you can make some speculations about what you're seeing, but really there's a million things that you just don't know, that you can't know. And for example, I can't recognize any of the species in these photographs. If you were from here, you'd probably recognize most of them or the main ones. And if you don't know what species you're looking at, you don't know anything about the dynamics of the change in that habitat, for example. Are they fast-growing trees? Are they slow-growing trees? Are they trees that grow after fire? Are they trees that are intolerant to fire and therefore indicate there hasn't been a fire in a really long time? Etc. There's a load of things you can interpret from habitat and habitat structure and the species that are in it and how they're organized and so on. I mean, basically, as an ecologist, that's what you learn to read in the landscape, is you learn to read the history of the place you're looking at. But, because I've never worked in Sudan, I look at these photos and I have really only the vaguest idea of what I'm seeing. So, and imagine, that you're not even an ecologist and you're just someone who's been sent to plant trees and you have just no notion of what any of this means, right? But that's the point, it's full of meaning. So that's why it's interesting to ask people to do this photo elicitation exercise. And this is just one example to show you just some of the things that people told us about each of the photographs, which help us to also see what it is that they're seeing. So here they say, for example, this is a natural forest because the trees are different in age, size, and are scattered, not placed in regular lines. The spacing is not equal. So like, actually, I could have told you that because that's common to any forest, but that's important. That's an important observation, obviously. They also say it's good pasturing land. There's not something I would necessarily be able to claim. I could guess that it might be because a lot of open woodlands are used for pasturing, but it's interesting to know that they immediately recognize this as good pasturing land, and then it might be interesting to, if you had the opportunity to ask further questions like what is not good pasturing land, what does that look like, what how do you what is it about this that makes it particularly good for pasturing? But I mean, I imagine that's something to do with the fact that there's shade and there's therefore going to be probably more growth of the herbaceous layer. And as you can see, there's quite a bit of herbaceous layer, which isn't too tall. And in this case, it's, looks like it's in the early growing season, so it must be fresh and nice to eat. They also say it's an old forest, which I wouldn't necessarily have guessed, but that's an interesting interpretation. It's interesting. And, again, something that, if possible, one would want to know a little bit more about. What makes them think it's old? There are obviously some young trees in it, but you can have young trees, obviously, and still be an old forest. And then I also found interesting, for this image, they said that where is the nearest area to our village? It looks like this, and they said it was quite far away, 4 or 5 kilometers away, or 4 hours on foot. Which, if you think about it, has something, that has implications for their access to good pasturing land and maybe to certain species that only grow in natural old forests, right? So they have, it would seem, relatively little access to these kind of resources. And yeah, and then here we have the men's community mapping, the maps they made in the community mapping workshop. These are a little bit hard to read, and we're going to need more help from Hafiz and Hussein to really understand everything that's going on in them. But so in the first map on the left is how they draw how the village currently is organized, and maybe, yeah, there are some trees in it, which they've drawn, but it's missing things that they would like. So here I can't see it, how to close it. They've added, for example, a wood lot with Acacia nilotica trees. They've added a tree nursery. They've added a community forest. And shelter belts as well, which are not, they're sort of drawn as little hashed lines, I think. The scutcher, by the way, is some kind of agricultural, I don't know, machine. And then, so the women do something quite similar. Again, on the left is their map of the current village. I mean, it's interesting, they obviously put the emphasis on slightly different things. They take a much close-up view of the village rather than a sort of, the men's view seems to be more of a large-scale map. But they've also added shelter belts, a tree nursery, a community forest, and they've indicated rangelands, which I think is also interesting. But I think Orit had a question about how much these local people are know about, maybe, I don't know, I forget how you put it, but yeah, conservation concepts around tree planting or this kind of thing, or how these projects are supposed to work. And I think seeing that they use terms like shelter belts, or even concepts of shelter belts, community forests, and things like that, I think that these people already have been quite highly exposed to concepts about how people plant trees, how trees are supposed to be planted in tree planting projects. So this is not kind of like some super naive or just a completely culturally endemic notion of what trees are doing in landscapes. This is clearly already coded through forestry notions and conservation notions of what you do with trees and conservation.
I didn't mean they were naive. I just
no, but naive to how people
do
these projects,
or that they're already inculcated in the NGO language.
Exactly. Well, that's what I'm
needing to grow trees, so that in some sense there's maybe convergence in some of the ideas here.
Yeah,
that was all I was interested in, but this is
no,
great.
yeah, no, I didn't mean to imply that you were implying anything negative. Maybe I just used the wrong word, but yeah, no, exactly, they've been inculcated already. Yes, and yeah, there are probably other details in here to sort of interpret, and so we've kind of asked for, again, more to clarify a bunch of issues that are in these images that we don't fully understand, or that we'd like more information about. So hopefully that will come out of the next couple rounds of fieldwork. Yeah. Yeah, so I didn't want to inundate you with loads of data, because by itself it's not very interesting necessarily out of context. But so that was just sort of what I wanted to show you about the kind of data that we're getting. And then maybe I should say a little bit about what we'll do with it. So yeah, I'll also talk a little bit about the design sort of the design aesthetic, or the design, how it will be designed, the final product will be designed, but also how that sort of interacts with other design approaches. But yeah, so what we want to do with this data is basically make a video which will be obviously a simulation based on the drawings and photographs and maps made by these people. But so the simulation will show the structure, the kind of species, the kind of uses that these people would like to have. If people do tree planting in the Great Green Wall context in their village, and that's what would be useful and interesting and make sense to them. So it would be basically, yeah, it's not like quite unlike the video from the Great Green Wall that I showed at the beginning. We don't want it to look like it's a fake documentary. We want it to be obviously a projection. But at the same time, based in these empirical details, based in what people say that they want. So very sort of in that sense, bottom up and not just not just an image of something ideal or something some kind of propaganda, but quite the opposite. So very contextualized. And in fact, like this, we'd have to say that this video that we'd make would really only be valid like for Gedaref state. Like you couldn't show this video and say this is what people want in some other part of Sudan, because they don't necessarily. That's one of the complexities of trying to make conservation restoration work site specific and relevant, socially and ecologically relevant, is that it's not very exportable. It doesn't travel very well. There are some very general concepts which travel, like shelter belts and community forests, but like how you organize the community forest, what species should be in it, etc. How do you plant them, how do you manage them, etc., and so on and so forth. It all has to be highly contextual if it's going to work properly in the long term, or be sustainable in an ecological sense. But I think that's part of the message that we want to project with the video as well, is that here's like a highly specific, culturally or like contextually sensitive projection of what people would like. And to have that as who the video is for is also important to be clear about, because the video is not for these people on the ground. They already know what they want. They don't need a simulation video to understand that. But the people who do need that are the funders, right? So our idea would be to take this video to some of these like big conservation conferences, and maybe the kind of forums where they kind of promote the Great Green Wall and try to interest high level funders, like different countries, to give several $1 million or $1 billion, whatever. So in the same kind of fora where they show that, the kind of video we saw in the beginning, and to have this as an alternative vision, really, of how you should be imagining the impact that you want to have if you're a high-level funder, basically. And then, hopefully that kind of vision redirected towards the ground, or from the ground up, I guess is a better way of putting it, would hopefully then sort of trickle down through to implementation, right? And at the same time, I think as Hafiz kind of points to in the comments he made in the video, this kind of bottom-up procedure or like way of working in conservation is very much because Hafiz is working with the FAO and people like that. It's he knows that this is how people now think you should do conservation. Top down is a little bit, let's say, old-fashioned, because it doesn't work very well most of the time, and so people have tried to develop more sensitive ways of doing these projects that take into account both ecological context and social context. So in many ways, there's nothing radical about that proposal from a conservation perspective. It's kind of what people are expected to do these days. Yeah, but for some reason the Great Green Wall is totally not in sync with that, and continues to be this very top-down kind of vision-led project, which really doesn't seem to care what's going on the ground. Yeah, I'll just stop there for a minute, I guess.
All right, thank you. I think now we have a bit of an overview of all three aspects, right? Both the project that we're critiquing, the methods that you're using to do the research, and the kind of alternative vision. So, Orit, there's a lot to respond to. I don't know what you'd like to start picking up on.
Well, there's time. I guess this conversation is about sort of, I guess, kind of working with you to progress this project, if I understood correctly, and also maybe just open a broader conversation about how we methodologically and situationally deal with questions of environment and scale. So, I mean, a bunch of things strike me about this, but I don't want to push too far. The first is, I guess, the whole time through this, I was kind of thinking about that, like, think globally, act locally, cliche, yet kind of true discourse that they kind of propagated in the 90s and early 2000s, these optimistic times. And I guess I kept thinking, and I just kept wondering a little bit about, and I had looked at the Green Wall, and they had the websites, and they had said that they had kind of self-monitored and that they needed to enhance kind of small scale, like interventions at local levels and small scale. So I guess one of my questions was that there's this question of the videos and how they're creating an image that sort of is to recruit a global audience, but is it automatically contrary? Like, I guess I want to hear more from you a little bit about the Green Wall policies. Are they actually saying let's grow the same tree all the way from the Sudan to, the other side of the Sahel, or are they actually like how is this? I'm kind of interested a little more in the interactions, or is it more that they're producing this vision, donors are getting it, maybe they're not investing enough or interested enough in the infrastructure at the local ground? Like, what's happening exactly there between the large scale and the scale you're talking about? And is it necessarily true? Like, can we think about, like, are they automatically antagonistic images in the sense of wanting to because everything you've been focused on is also counter desertification and degradation. And that leads to a second question. So just first, I just wanted to kind of ask about sort of why you think, or talk to me a little bit more about the specific projects, like implementation on the ground, and how those images, in your opinion, are driving particular types of investment, if they're even investing at all in this by now. And then I was wondering a little bit also, like, along with this research, do you just ask in general what people want in the future? Like, not about trees. Like, maybe they don't even want a farm. I don't know. Like, maybe they want to have the solar farm. Like, I don't know, like solar panel. Like, maybe they want a totally different technology or different sort of lifestyle. Like, I'm just wondering, like, this is very naive and very kind of foolish, but since you're kind of focusing already on trees and trees planning, which is sort of seems like part of this sort of project, I'm kind of wondering if along with that, you kind of ask them, like, what other things do they want? Like a big road, like more cell phone towers? Like, I don't know what the community would actually like to, what kind of future vision of economy or even of their society they might have. Like, does it always return to trees and agriculture, or are there other things going on in this particular site? Just out of curiosity.
Thanks. So yeah, no, the Great Green Wall is not planting the same tree the whole way along. So they kind of I guess each country was supposed to figure out what trees to plant in its implementation of the Great Green Wall in its country. And each country went through that process differently. So some countries did it in a got a bunch of botanists and ecologists together to really think about what are the trees that belong in each spot and so on. And others did it in some opaque manner, which you have no idea how they came up with the list. So it varied. And then, of course, the set of trees for each country varies. So they're supposed to be I think the majority of the trees that are being planted are native trees to those regions, so it's not like exotic or trees or something like that. Yeah, so I mean, the question of what's happening on the ground versus what's being sort of projected at the large scale and whether that difference matters. I don't know. It's difficult to say because it is simply just very difficult to know what's happening on the ground if you're not on the ground. And I think that was one of the surprises because the original project that we wanted to do on the Great Green Wall, looking at how data about the project or from the project circulates, we assumed there was a whole bunch of data, like monitoring data, because that's all the documentation about the Great Green Wall that they've published about how they do things. They say there's loads of data being produced and circulated and so on. I couldn't find it, you know. I mean, it's just extremely difficult to find. I mean, like I said, the data that you can find is not the data you really thought they should be producing or that they claim that they're producing about ecological effects of some kind. It's really just like we planted X number of trees without any follow-up most of the time. And it's just scattered around these very difficult to find, you know, places rather than being put together in some large database, as you might expect from the way they describe what they're doing. So the only way to really know what's happening if you're not there is to go there. But, you know, a lot of these countries, unfortunately, are not super easy to go to these rural sites because they have political problems, they have instability. And at the same time, that's part of the argument for why the project should be implemented, because it's supposed to make the unstable stable, you know, and solve all the political problems through tree planting. Yeah, so a lot of these areas are quite inaccessible if you're not from there as well, right? Like Sudan, unfortunately, we can't go there to do this project. So there's a lot of mystery about what's actually happening. I mean, then you can ask, well, I mean, so what? Like, if anything is happening at all, isn't it probably a good thing? And yeah, I mean, you can certainly make that argument that maybe any tree planting is better than no tree planting, but I mean, maybe it's not. It also depends on how the trees are being planted, right? I don't know. A lot of the times the trees, like at least in the early implementation in Senegal, for example, the tree planting was all done inside fenced areas. So people who would potentially benefit from those trees, like herders, would want to use the land because it's good pasture land, or people who might want some other kind of resource from the trees can't access them. And in fact, the herders that caused them a lot of problems because they had to herd around these large fenced areas when they would have previously crossed the area. So it caused a lot of, you know, access problems to people. So, and that was also because they weren't consulted. So in Senegal's case, they after a while sort of changed that and they made it more consultative, although as far as I understand, they still fence all of the reforested areas. So it all kind of depends what you expect out of the project. If you say, well, you know, on some level, just the fact that there's funding going into the environmental ministries or whoever of the governments and giving them something to do, maybe that is just, you know, good enough because it's, you know, allowing them to sort of in a sense funding the environmental ministry or something like that, right? So there are a lot of arguments you could potentially make about why it doesn't really matter what's actually happening. There are a lot of co-benefits, but at the same time, you could point to ways of doing implementation which, you know, cause problems for people locally and could be done a lot better. So, but, you know, in the absence of a really clear idea of what's happening, except in some parts of Senegal and some parts of Sudan before the war, and a couple other places, it's, you know, it's hard to say, does it make a difference? Or like, what difference is it making? I don't know. It's difficult to say. And so, I mean, part of our intervention was just to say, yeah, I mean, if you could do it better, according to the people who are affected by it, what would that look like? You know, at least now we have a clear answer in their terms. Yeah, and so, yes, we did not really ask them, like, just in general, what would be a better world from your perspective, right? We really did just ask them about trees because the project is defined within the context of the Great Green Wall. And I don't know all the Great Green Wall definitely funds other things like sedentary agriculture and tries to discourage people from being herders, basically, which I'm not sure that I'm really in favor of. But so we really just wanted to concentrate on the tree planting because we know that tree planting happens within the context of this project. We know there's funding for tree planting. And if we can make a difference in how that money is used, potentially, that would be something concrete that we could, aim to have as an outcome potentially of this project. And so, yeah, in that sense, we didn't ask them all the things they might want to have different in their lives because we can't intervene in that, and the Great Green Wall doesn't necessarily intervene in that either. Like, I don't think the Great Green Wall does road building or cell phone tower building, for example. Maybe it does at this point. I have no idea what they spend their money on, but we just sort of frame the project within something that we know happens and try to make that happen better. At the same time, like the people in this village, for example, at least the ones who participated in this are not full-time farmers. They're all kind of like part-time farmers. They mostly had office jobs and then they kind of farm, in their spare time, or they would have been more involved in farming when they were children, maybe farming and herding. So they already have quite a mixed lifestyle, in fact.
I mean, that's pretty interesting. I think what I was, what is really compelling to me about this project is both, and I guess next you can discuss the kind of images you're thinking of creating, whether they're about creating these kind of local maps. I mean, you're already giving me images here in some sense of what people envision the kind of local system looking like. I think I was more trying to understand it, how you're thinking as you're projecting the image of the future. There is always, of course, debates about, and this is, I guess, a really important design and urban planning, right? Like, we're also always thinking about the futures we want to build in our imaginaries. And obviously, when we deal with the climate crisis and transforming environments, there's lots of ways people deal with it, for good or for bad. Like, in Japan, they like to build seawalls, whether those are the best things to do or not. So whether you build a seawall or a wetland, whether you grow some green trees or, I don't know, put up some other barrier or some other types of systems. These are obviously political, economic decisions. So part of my question was sort of about the in general, the vision of greenness and maybe conceptions of Africa kind of coming out of this sort of idea. And I was really compelled by the fact they're already, obviously these villages are undergoing that, have been undergoing for quite a while, a lot of changes, urbanization, people aren't, quite in the same agricultural economies, maybe. And so I'm wondering, so that's just a very interesting, both methodological question in terms of how you're going about and how you're envisioning both technology and environment in this setting in Sudan, but as well how your respondents are, maybe they're fine with deserts and they just want to live in an air-conditioned house. Like, I mean, these are legitimate.
Yeah.
I don't want to be simplistic, but there's also a way, like, why do people in Africa just want to grow trees and everyone else gets to get in a high-tech smart city or whatever.
Yeah.
So these are some of the conversations, I guess I'm wondering how you're thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you just go, can I go back? Yes, now that went forward. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, obviously they do live in a place which to some people looks like a desert, right? I mean, it's dry, it's kind of flat and a bit empty. It's not a lush place, it's not tropical or semi-tropical, right? And I don't think that that bothers them, right? Like they never, none of them, for none of the pictures did they say this is a hideous wasteland or something, right? They didn't say anything negative about any of the pictures, as far as I remember. They all had a use, they all had a history, they all, had, people knew what they were looking at. So, it's really outsiders. It's Europeans, it's colonial powers in the past. It's people who have some of these like techno, I don't know, save the world notions that everything can be greened, or like these notions, there are a bunch of techniques, right, where you like come in and make some kind of very dense like kind of a garden with trees, which is supposed to be highly productive and makes everything super green. And I forget there's like a couple that techniques that are supposed to do that, and which are really driven off this kind of obsession with productivity, like high productivity, right? But some places just are not high productivity. They're just naturally dry, right? And low productivity. And I think, yeah, somehow there's even not just a lot of ecologists, but a lot of conservationists, a lot of development people who can't get their head around that being okay. Like they really think that things are better, yeah, when they're green and dense and lush and have loads of water dripping off all the leaves and everything. And they try to recreate that. But I mean, not only is it probably unsustainable ecologically, but it's also, I think, unnecessary. I mean, people know how to live in these habitats, and these habitats are what they're used to. And it's not the habitat which is creating the problem for them. And in that sense, a lot of the discussion around degradation is a kind of a misreading of landscapes, right? I mean, there's several books and like misreading the African landscape and the critiques of degradation as kind of a fantasy of some, colonial power, for example, or whoever that wants thinks that if they could be given control of how the landscape was managed, they would make it so much more productive and economically, resource creating, which is probably not even true, right? They would just overexploit it for a very brief period of time, and then it would be actually, degraded. So I think, yeah, I don't think that the people in these habitats, in these regions, want to do tree planting for those reasons. Like that's not when they think of tree planting, I don't think that they're trying to imagine converting their, the area where they live into some kind of fantasy of a tropical Africa, right? I think they just want to, and here it's hard to sort of separate out, because as we said, like they clearly already know some sort of terminology and concepts that come from conservation tree planting, like, community forest and shelter belts. So maybe they just pick up on these because they feel like they're expected to say that. I don't know. It's hard to tell, especially since I'm not there during the interview. But they pick these out maybe because they're functional, because they do have they will yield benefits. Shelter belts will prevent erosion in erosive areas, and erosion is not inherently bad, but it can be inconvenient, right, for people. So I think they see trees as something you can use to produce certain resources or services. And so why not, if someone wants to know how would you like trees to be planted, that's how you'd like to be planted so that they're useful to you, right? As opposed to, embodying some fantasy of somebody else about productivity and lushness.
Is that something you're encountering a lot? So basically what I'm hearing is kind of this critique of ecosystem services as a kind of paradigm. And I heard that in a movie where there was a kind of idea that this greening is going to result in greater agricultural productivity and food security for people. And I did notice the sketching in each of these images about future visions, where I guess there's no sketcher right now, and that is actually a kind of economic question that, or I don't know, maybe I don't know anything, to be honest. I've never worked in anywhere in Africa really, so I can't say anything. But yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting about what kind of image you're trying to produce beyond or outside of ecosystem services. And in general, a question for everyone who's a designer or planner, right? Because we do tend to think about habitats in terms of the stuff they provide for the inhabitants, depending, and of course, whether you're coming from outside and you have a vision of what the inhabitant is, or whether even the communities do, which I guess opens to other questions about which maybe have no application in this field at all, but also the question of more than human, or sort of how or what kind of images you want to produce about, or what do people say about their relations to the environment, or if that's part of your question. Like right now you're doing a lot of mapping projects. I don't know if you're doing any kind of discussion about people's kind of relationship to trees, or to their agricultural practices, or what have you.
Yeah, so we wanted to get more information about those relationships in the next phase. We've asked a bunch of specific questions about that because it didn't come out very much in what we got the first time. Yeah, about the relationship to the trees, how they use them, you know, this kind of thing. And hopefully through the drawings that they make, we'll also get some sense of those relationships and so on. Yeah, what I wanted to say about the nursery, for example, is important, like in relating to what you were saying, because they don't currently have a nursery, and that's a tree nursery, right? So part of their imaginary is basically about having control over the trees. So as Hafiz mentioned, it's been implemented in the Great Green Wall so far has been implemented in a very top-down way. So they don't have access to a nursery. They don't produce their own trees, and they don't plant their own trees. It's all done by the government without their input. So yeah, part of what they want is to have control over. They get to produce and choose where to plant the trees and what trees to grow and so on. So yeah, I think it is, you know, it's part of sort of taking control, and it's part of maybe, yeah, there's probably I think there's an economic element because they're also interested in certain trees that have fruits and so on. So yeah, I think they do partly see this as a kind of economic development, improving their quality of life in various ways. But yeah, so a lot of these details of what exactly they mean by that weren't super apparent, and so that's why we're having several rounds of fieldwork, because I mean that's also, yeah, one of the issues I wanted to highlight is that this way of doing research where you, like, I can't go to the field and I have to talk to other people and tell them what I didn't understand, and then, you know, then they have to translate what I didn't understand in terms that the villagers understand, and then they, you know, there's like all these translation back and forth. It's already hard enough to interview rural people about these things when you're not from there, right? But then in my experience in other places, you know, there's always some low level of mutual misunderstanding which you have to get around. And then this is just like much harder because it's like there's all these sort of, you know, the Europe team talking to the Sudan team, which is in Egypt, talking to the Sudan team in Sudan, who's talking to the people in the village. And it occurred to me that, I mean, this kind of game of like telephone, trying to understand what the people in the village see, what they perceive, what they want, and then translate it back up, you know, to the designer, is in some ways the same problem that we're trying to solve, right? Like all these funders who've never been to the field and have no clue about the context of this, you know, the tree planting that they're funding. And so, you know, in a way, it's not necessarily, I mean, it's inconvenient, obviously, that we can't all just go to Sudan and see it for ourselves, and, you know, ask all the questions that we have directly, but which we couldn't do anyway because we don't all speak Arabic. But you know, our struggles to solve this problem of understanding what it is that they see and what it is that they want is kind of the problem really the basic problem that we're trying to solve anyway, right? But and then how do we represent, if we can come to have some grasp on that, how do we represent that to another layer of people, right? Through design. So
do you ever see so that's a really compelling thing, actually. And I had two thoughts as you were speaking, and I don't know if Kenny or Laurie.
I just wanted to let people know that we're like 20 minutes or less out from the end. So if there's questions from the audience, now would be the time. And Meredith, I don't know if you wanted to say more about the third part, about the design.
Yeah.
Should I just go? I just have one slide about that, so.
Yeah, maybe start with that, and then we can start wrapping up and maybe zooming out a little bit what the relevance of this particular research is for the larger questions for the series.
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, I maybe I won't say everything I was maybe thinking about saying since we don't have as much time, but anyway, so the designer that we're working with, as I said, he was one of my former students at Eindhoven Design Academy, and I was pretty interested to work with him on this project. I mean, I wish he was here so he could say why he was interested to work with us, but because he uses the kind of what do you call it, like gaming programming to make these sort of immersive simulation things, and he had previously worked on projects that were about tree planting and kind of playing with the idea of tree planting, and then maybe different ways of doing that. And then he had this project which he did after we submitted after we started this project on Sudan. So this is a recent project which he did in collaboration with some other people. And I can't see anything because this thing is covering it. Called the Earth. Whoops, sorry, the Earth Codec. So I could just very briefly show you that. And in a way, it's almost, in some ways, the opposite of what we're doing, but then there's also a way in which it's very similar. So I thought maybe we could think about that quickly. I just thought I might skip ahead if I can find the place. Part 2. So they're imagining like, no, sorry, I'm holding the one with Terry's intelligence. It's all fine-tuned. I can't find the right thing. Anyway, full potential. So they're imagining like a kind of a requires both the sensory emergent, self-sensing, all these sensors, and they would all be connected, and the Earth would be sensing itself. Foundation models may enable the synthesis. Trained on vast amounts of data via unsupervised learning, foundation models accumulate a body of general knowledge that can then be fine-tuned for downstream tasks. Despite their massive scale, the training corpus of existing foundation models reflects a mere fraction of possible data scraped from the detritus of the internet. Language, let alone human culture, is only a subset of the wealth of information imminent to the biosphere. The aperture of what these models observe should widen to include the ecological and the non-human. There is nothing, however, that limits potential foundation models to text alone. The planet produces stimuli in the form of energy, particles, waves, and fields. Transduced by machine sensors, these signals provide a potential multimodal input for models. Current foundation model. Yeah, I'm not going to have us watch all of that, but so, okay, this is in some ways very different from what we're proposing. In other ways, it's weirdly similar. So what I just wanted to say with this is maybe two things. One, to show you the aesthetic that Connor uses, and maybe it would look somewhat like that, but beyond the aesthetic and what it might look like as a video, I think in this project that he did, I haven't talked to him about it yet, to be honest, because I just actually saw it for the first time this afternoon, but he had told me about it before. What's interesting about it is that this kind of if you watch the whole video, maybe it's clearer, but like this sort of massive sense, array of sensors of all kinds on the planet sensing ecological data, and then being joined together and analyzed using, artificial intelligence and spitting out some kind of patterns, which are then used to like, in some unclear way, intervene and change the course of, climate problems or whatever, conservation problems, restoration problems. To me, it seems a lot like a big giant hallucination. And I don't necessarily mean this in the sense that Connor and his colleagues are hallucinating, but more in the sense that like the system that they're imagining is like it's like when you're dreaming, it's as though the world were dreaming. Like, because when you dream, your brain randomly puts together a bunch of like sensations and different bits of memories of stuff that happened recently, puts them in some weird pattern, and then you wake up and you're like, oh, that really meant something. I wonder what that meant. Maybe that's predicting the future. I feel like that's exactly what this big system and many other similar, proposals, because there are many kind of similar proposals already, are really doing. It's like a big dreamscape of the Earth dreaming and trying to predict what's going to happen next, and then taking action based on its interpretation of its dream. And in a way you can relate. So this is just like one genre of imagery about how we understand what's going on Earth and how we intervene in that, right? How we make sense of it and then intervene in it. The video that I showed at the beginning from the Great Green Wall, the fake virtual reality video, is another genre of video, which is kind of doing the same thing. It's also just a complete, imaginary projection of something. Is a completely different, it's a more traditional propaganda styled genre, right? But in a way, all of these things are just about the circulation and interpretation of images. And that's also what our project is doing, even though our project is doing it in a super low tech, a super like human-centered way. Basically, that's what we're asking people to do, is produce images that we can interpret and then circulate. So even though all these images have like really different aesthetics and maybe really different values behind them, in a way, they're all kind of doing the same thing.
Orit, this sounds like it's really up your alley, that project.
This is definitely up my alley. Yeah, I mean, it's Benjamin Ben's planetary scale computing. One of the things I think would be really interesting for you guys to investigate at a design level was, I thought actually you said something very compelling about translation. And one of the things when people build foundational models for large language models for AI and this kind of fantasy of planetary sentience that they can't account for is actually time and space. Like they can't account for it. So they can't, there is no place in this model for translation. I actually found it really compelling and interesting that you had to do these translations. Like, I don't know what's going on the ground. Maybe I couldn't even speak Arabic. That we know that in some sense something is visible in your process or should be made visible in your images. It is about the fact that we never really know each other perfectly anyway, even if we speak great English and are sitting in the same room and even in the same culture. But that there may something emerge out of those lapses of translation around a kind of maybe humility in the form of knowledge that would be really interesting to show, that maybe doesn't come out in the dream. There's something, what's nice about the hallucinating nets, and of course, neural nets hallucinate all the time. And that's a large feature of the fact that they find patterns in anything. They're liable to produce ecological fallacy at any time as though it is truth. But they can also create magical, amazing images that are crazy, because it's sort of, so this idea of feeding in our dreams, but somehow being conscious that the difference between a project like what you're doing is that, and what this is imagining, is that you're imagining abilities to sense and produce understandings of it, of environments and relations, perhaps beyond those of any one human being. I think that's where people get excited about computing, because there is something also possible about the fact that we as collectives, as networks, can cognate at scales beyond my individual body, and also with other things that are not just human. But there's also a kind of problem in the visualization of that as a seamless, apolitical, ahistorical, like process. And so I'm really interested in you plumbing this idea of dreams, but also this problem of translation, because that's not what the Green Wall is saying. They're not saying we're having problems understanding what people on the ground are, but I think there's something, and this is just old school anthropology. I guess I'm like nostalgic for back when we talked about translation. but but I do think that's a really interesting question that never goes away. And ultimately, we always have to deal with that, because there's no way we're going to deal with environmental questions or anything just locally or just globally. So there's always this necessary of working across scales. But I thought it's really nice how you put your translation question, and that might be really interesting to figure out how to visualize or create alternative images to the kind of seamless flow of sensors into like a global sentience that would be really miraculous, at least for me. And I think is something we really struggle with, because I have to say, even the most popular, even supposedly critiques of AI show like seamless flow charts between, like, even if they're being critical, between cobalt to labor to automation, like even the most critical images of our technical systems tend to operate that way around seamlessness and interoperability. Even though we
Can I jump in and ask, to me, it's interesting that you seem to be veering towards this kind of dream of, smooth datascapes. If you could, maybe that's already an old school world word by now. But on the other hand, you're talking about the fact that there is no data, right? The whole project is just the number of workshops and the number of trees you're claiming, right? So why are you veering towards this dream of perfect datalization of the world if it's actually about the lack of data of the ground?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, this is a separate project that Connor did. I just sort of wanted to show it as a contrast, or as a kind of a discussion point, and also to show like the kind of work he does. But indeed, I think that's kind of the sticking point, is that it's easy to claim or imagine some kind of seamless data interoperability, and like the documentation about the Great Green Wall does claim that there's all this data and it's interoperable and all of these, buzzwords about how data is supposed to be, but it's not. So maybe, that's part of the maybe critique that one would have about this kind of vision that's in this project that he did, because it's all very well to imagine that, but does it ever actually work that way, on the ground? And if it doesn't work that way, what is that, what do you have in the end? You have just nothing. I don't know, you have something that doesn't work. You have a really malfunctioning hallucination system. But I think, so then I think it's interesting to say, well, okay, if that's not how the project is being implemented, and this kind of aesthetic of how we could sense and understand the world and intervene in the world isn't working, at least in this case, right? What's an alternative? It's not necessarily that we, I think for me, the interesting thing is that, like, we're still basically operating in terms of the circulation of images about how people want things to be, and this sort of notion of, interpretation and translation. I think interpretation is really important as well as translation, because to me, part of the reason maybe that some of these visions of, a world that's self-sensing through technological, automated, AI-driven sensors, I think that comes out of the fact that people who imagine these things can't interpret landscapes. They don't know how. That's nothing. That's something they've never learned to do, right? Because of whatever their background, or because fewer and fewer people know how to do that these days. But I mean, for the people, like the people in this village in Gadarif state, they look at a landscape and they can, it's not because they don't have technological sensors telling them a lot of data about what they're seeing, but they can just interpret what the landscape and understand a whole bunch of things about what's happening and what happened in the recent past, and a whole set of interactions, and they can read the landscape. So you don't need this sort of AI-driven technological sensor network in order to get a whole lot of information out of the structure of the habitat. Of course, it's not happening at a planetary scale; it's happening at a very different scale. But yeah, I don't know. I kind of think that there are, in some ways, more points of contact. It's just that the aesthetic, the sort of values behind them are so different than they look. They look like radically different ways of thinking about the world, but I don't know that they are.
Thank you, Meredith. And I think there's like lots of food for thought. And I think the interesting, coming back to the kind of three big notions that kind of bound the series together, which is kind of the South, the planetary, and design. I think you've given a very candid account of, how difficult it can also be to navigate this in a practical way of bringing together these different logics of questioning, etc. And I was wondering, Orit, we've got a few minutes left, 2 minutes maybe, for a final kind of statement, from your end on these three connections, right? The South, the planetary, and design, and where we, I guess, go from here and in this kind of series and forwards towards, I guess, planetary notions of design.
Well, I thought this was a great presentation. Thank you, Meredith, and great work. So I hope the questions were meant mostly in the interest of a conversation that I think we all struggle with, which is essentially bringing these things together. I think for me, I'm really interested in kind of obviously breaking modernist ideas between like technology, primitivity, South, the kind of standard baggage that comes to this, which I think you did really interestingly. And I think that what you really highlighted was the interesting question just of what aesthetics we need to produce in order to both imagine, in this case, environmental transformations at different scales, and being able to account for the differences. Like one of the interesting questions of the planetary, right, is thinking about how we can share synchronous, like the planet or everyone living on it can synchronously, be exposed to particular processes, whether they're the climate change or technological, like we're all enmeshed in digital infrastructures. But at the same time, of course, that those things are impacted, felt, and actually embody and manifest themselves radically differently according to history, space, time, older questions of coloniality, economy, politics, and culture, of course, and as well as histories of knowledge and power. And so I think that this kind of project exhibits the kind of things we're trying to struggle with, but also I enjoy the fact that you really insist on also maintaining, returning to an attempt to kind of reinvent or maybe intervene in certain types of technical aesthetics and imaginaries that are so potent. And I think a real critical feature in this whole project, right, has been about producing futures, right? And how we future and through what images of both thought and action. And so I thought that this discussion kind of brought that in a really nice material way, the issues that are contended with as we try to produce alternative images. I really like that you insisted on this question of circulating images as central to the way you constructed your project and its design and its ambitions. And I look forward to further discussion and to seeing the project and manifest itself and hopefully further conversation between all of us. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everybody. And thank you also to our audience for sticking around. Kenny, do you want the last word?
It's going to be very brief, just to say thank you so much, Meredith, for your presentation. Thank you, Orit, for being the discussion partner today. And like the two of you, we also very much look forward to seeing how the project evolves, wraps up, and to have further discussion about that soon. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. Have a lovely day. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.